My name is Jeff Fout. Today's date is December 8th, 2009. I am interviewing William Gary Summers at Ball State University about his experience in the military during the Vietnam War era. Good evening, Mr. Summers.
Good evening.
For the record, sir, please spell your name.
It's William, W-I-L-L-I-A-M, Summers, S-U-M-M-E-R-S.
Where and what date were you born?
I was born October 23rd, 1945.
What was
Muncie, Indiana, I'm sorry.
Thank you. What was your father's occupation and your mother's, if she had one?
My father was a factory worker, basically. In later life, he became an appliance repairman and salesman, and my mother was a beautician.
Had they lived in Muncie all of their lives?
No, they actually moved. My family is actually from Tennessee. I have an older sister who was actually born in Tennessee. They moved to Muncie looking for work back in the 40s, just before I was born, and so I was the first actual person in my family born in Indiana.
So I take it you did have some siblings.
I had an older sister, yes. I have an older sister.
What year did you graduate from high school?
Graduated from high school in 1963.
What did you think of the United States' involvement in Vietnam after you graduated from high school?
I basically didn't think much of it at first. I actually attended Ball State for a year after I graduated from high school, and obviously knew the war, knew there was a draft, and was involved in the draft. The draft was the worst thing that I recall about the Vietnam War. It was such a, as a 17, 18-year-old kid, I really hadn't. My parents, neither my father, and my mom or my father, neither one were military background at all. So I hadn't really thought about it a lot, but I had several friends of mine who were close or thought they were going to be drafted, and they were looking at alternatives. I was in college, but I wasn't really very mature and didn't know if I wanted to hang with college at that point in time. And so 5 of us actually joined the military at that time. We joined the Air Force, and their objectives at that time were to try to stay out of Vietnam, thinking that not being in the Army or the Marines, they would be able to do that. And I wanted to kind of, see something, do some different things, and that. But my real thoughts of the Vietnam War were not necessarily it was a good war, bad war at that point in time. It was I think probably it bought into the whole thing about, protecting, fighting back communism. I mean, that was the big thing back in 1963 and 64 was, trying to prevent the spread of communism, and pretty much had bought into that theory at that time.
At what age did you enlist in the Air Force?
I was 18. I was, just turned 18.
Was this right out of high school?
No,
I apologize. You've been going to Ball State.
Yeah, I had actually gone to Ball State for a year.
Okay. Where did you take your basic in the Air Force?
Basic training was in Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas.
And what was the length of your basic training?
Basic training at that point in time, they were really rushing people through, so it was kind of a split program. It was 6 weeks at Lackland, and then what we were transferred, or many people were transferred to a technical school. And during so at tech school, you finished, basic was supposed to be 8 weeks long. Mm-hmm. So once you got to the tech school, you completed the 2 weeks basic training, and while you were kind of waiting to get into a class for the tech school.
What made you choose intelligence, specifically Morse code?
It actually chose me. When we joined, we had a couple of options, but one of the things that we did when we first got to basic training was we just, everybody goes through a battery of tests, written tests, physical tests, those kinds of tests. and they grade you out and try to determine what areas that you might be, where you might be best suited for. And one of the areas that I was selected for, along with many others, obviously, was in the area of intelligence gathering. And my specialty was Morse code. That's what I ended up being trained into. There were several other areas of intelligence gathering that you could have been selected to, but back in those days, you really didn't get to direct yourself as much as one might think. I mean, you were pretty much, if they had a slot where they needed you and you fit the mold, that's where you went.
How long was your training in Morse code?
Basically, I got to, and it was at Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi, in Biloxi, Mississippi, was where I trained. And I got there, so it would have been 6 weeks, would have been in November. I entered the service in September of '64. So I got to Keesler about in November, late November, and was there for about 7 or 8 months, I think, all told. And not only part of the training was typing, because we transcribed the Morse code via a typewriter.
Did you find the training difficult for Morse code?
I didn't really find it that difficult. The interesting thing was that I'd taken a class in typing at Ball State during my year, so that put me way ahead of a lot of the other guys who tried. You know, it was JRJ, FU, you know, I mean, over and over and over again. But I really had pretty much knew how to type, knew the keyboard, obviously, so that put me way ahead. The Morse code was certainly not easy. I mean, you know, to think that they had to train you for 8 months to learn Morse code, I mean, I think shows that it was somewhat difficult. And it's not only a matter of knowing that a letter, what the Morse code was for that letter, but it was getting that to a certain keystroke as well. So it was kind of a combination thing that you had to learn to be able to do that and develop your speed. In order to graduate from the tech school, you had to be able to copy Morse code at 18 groups per minute. They got instead of a word, they said a group, so it was a five character group would be, and you had to copy that at a speed of 18 groups per minute in order to graduate.
So a group is a word?
It's 5 characters, which takes the place of a word. Obviously, a word can be longer, shorter than that, but so they would just use it as 5 characters.
So after your 8 weeks of training, were you feeling pretty comfortable and confident in your ability?
8 months.
I'm sorry, 8 months.
Well, I passed I passed it, and you know, the interesting thing, and what it was interesting to me at least, was that when I went into the Air Force, I had hoped to stay in the United States, kind of serve my 4 years in the States and get out and go on and do something else. But the career field that they entered me into, you know, intelligence, 100% of the people that got into that went overseas. So I learned early on that I wasn't going to be spending my tour in the United States. But after I graduated, I felt pretty good about, you know, my training. I thought the training was good. A lot of it, you know, during that period of time, of course, in basic training, and not only in tech school, but you do a lot of military training and mission-oriented training. Okay, you know, not only did I have to copy Morse code, teach me to copy Morse code, but they told me why I was copying Morse code and how it and what it would be involved in and how it would be processed, and all of those kinds of things as well. We actually worked under the auspices of the National Security Agency, NSA, which some people may have heard of, some people may not, but very secretive organization, obviously.
Where was your first tour of duty?
Well, after I graduated from tech school, I went to Misawa Air Base, Japan, which is in northern Japan, and I was there for 2 years, a little over 2 years, and actually, when we get to Vietnam, I actually went from Misawa, Japan to Vietnam and then back to Japan. And I think I'd mentioned that. I was actually what's called TDY to Vietnam, which is temporary duty. I was not, the alternative of that was PCS, where you permanent change of station, where you would spend the length of the tour that is normally, and that is a year tour. Vietnam was a year tour. Japan was a 2-year tour. Every place they had designated was a certain length. Some places, like Hawaii, for example, Hickam Air Force Base was a three-year tour. So the better the tour, the longer it was. And so the shorter the tour, you know that was not good. So if it was a year tour, like Shimmy, Alaska, and Thule, Greenland, those were all year tours.
What was your impression of Japan?
Well, my thoughts of Japan were always early, before, you know, what I'd learned in school and whatever, was that Japan was a very nice, warm, I always thought Japan was like Florida. You know, it was warm all year round, and obviously the women, geisha girls, and that. Well, I was stationed in Misawa, Japan, which is in the northern part of the main island. And basically we averaged about 270 inches of snow a year. So that was a shock to first, right, although I got there in June of 65, late June of 65, when it was summer. It wasn't, you know, people like to tell you what's going on, and so I found out very early on that the winters were bad. So I apologize for this. You might edit that out, but anyway. I found out that the snowfall was very significant, and the first year I was there, my first impression and my first knowledge of what Japan was supposed to be like was shattered immediately. You know, it wasn't, you know, now Tokyo and southern Japan is very warm, and it was what I thought Japan was like. But I was I was up north, and it was, the winters were, it never really got to 0 or very, very cold, but it would start snowing about 1st of December, and it snowed every day until sometime in March. So that was definitely a change.
What rank were you when you were in Japan?
Basically, when I went to Japan, I was an E3, which at that time, they change it all the time. At that time was called an Airman Second Class. Okay, I don't even think it's called that now. But at that time it was called an Airman Second Class. It was an E3. And I was, during the 2-year period, I was promoted to E4, which again was Airman First Class. But then about 3 months before I left Japan, they changed it and started calling that rank Sergeant. So I ended up being a sergeant, but it was just, they changed the rank.
You were stationed on an Air Force base?
Correct.
And you were in intelligence?
Correct.
Did your uniform have any insignias on it or any type of identification saying that you were intelligence, or were you guys kept very hush-hush?
We didn't have the United States Air Force Security Service, which is what I worked under. United States Air Force Security Service was the command. The Air Force is broken up into commands. That was the command. Has their own patch, and we wore hats that had that patch on it. But we had a very high security clearance, as high as it could get. It was at the time called the top secret crypto security clearance. So that was another thing. In order to actually, once I graduated tech school, they had done the security background, the background information, where the FBI went around and talked to my parents and my neighbors and all of that, you know, to do the background, to get the security clearance. So Misawa Air Base was a unique kind of a situation, and it had a main base, and then the security service actually worked about 5 miles from the main base on a hill, and it was called the Hill. So, you know, people say, well, where do you work on the base? I said, well, we used to say we worked on the hill. We never really called it, the command, or we were in a wing under the command, which is called the 6921st Security Wing. And as a Morse intercept operator, which is what I was just one small part. We had there were many people that did other things. We had Russian linguists, we had Chinese linguists, we had back in those days we intercepted communications of all kinds: voice, Morse code, teletype, and from people that we wanted to gather the intelligence from.
I understand that you were gathering intelligence between the Chinese and the...
Well, when I was in Vietnam, mainly when I was in Japan, we intercepted
North Korean and Russia.
North Korea, Russia, China, but we also intercepted Vietnamese, northern Vietnamese, communications. And when I was in Vietnam, basically it was communications between North Vietnam and China.
Getting back to Japan, what type of information would you be receiving between, let's say, North Korea and the
Well,
Russians?
typically, a lot of what I did in Japan was inter-country. I mean, it would be, for example, it would be a military establishment in Russia, for example, and you would have communication. It would be like a control station or a head. It would be the head honcho in maybe Vladivostok, for example, and then there would be 10 outstations, 10 other military or units that were in other cities or other areas. It'd be like here we have Air Force bases or air bases, military bases all over the country. So the communications that I would be intercepting would be between the control station and those outstations, for example.
Okay.
And it would be about all sorts of kinds of things, different things. Now, obviously, in Vietnam, it was more direct to the war effort. I mean, it would be, communications between North Vietnam and China, for example, could be about anything. But we also monitored troop movements through that vehicle. I mean, there were other areas that were doing it as well. But we would, so our communication, our intelligence was meshed with a lot of other intelligence.
So you would gather information or intelligence, and you would pass it along to another part of the air base or another.
No, the
communication
the hill,
the hill.
The 6921st Security Wing. Basically, we gathered that information, and it was ultimately processed through a filtering system there, what's good, what's bad, what needs to be go, and then it ultimately ended up with it at NSA.
You were in Japan, and then you got your orders for Vietnam.
Yes.
Did you have any type of R&R in between those orders?
No. I was transferred. I went TDY to Da Nang Air Base in Vietnam, and it was the 6924th Security Squadron. And basically, it was just starting up, and so what they were doing was manning it with temporary personnel. So a lot of guys from Japan, Philippines, Taiwan, Thailand were all kind of borrowed for a period of time. It basically was 89 days. 89 days is critical because if you go 90 days, then they have to give you the benefits of being in a war zone for a year. So I would have got, tax-free income, the tax benefits, and all of the combat pay and everything that went with being there, for permanently or for a permanent change. But being TDY, 89, and I'll tell you, they got me out of there in 89 days, and they made sure. I don't know why it was so important, but it was apparently a dollar-saving method. But there were a lot of guys that I was with in Japan. We rotated in and out of there, and so I was there for 89 days. So my Vietnam experience was somewhat limited compared to a lot of other people. but I often told people, I said, when you're 20 years old, 89 days seem like a long time.
What was your first impression of Vietnam?
Oh, I had heard, I mean, by that time, obviously, I was very familiar with what was going on in Vietnam, just because of the briefings and the communication between people that had been there, people that were, had come back. And so, my impression was that, that I was going to be, ushered in and ushered out, and I wasn't going to be out, I flew into Tan Son Nhut Air Base and flew to Da Nang and was there for my 89 days, worked 12 hours, and was off for 12 hours. But my impression going in was that, that it was a very important mission. The interesting thing, and I could tell you a lot more about Japan, but the interesting thing is that we always felt like we had a very important mission. And when I was in Japan, there were a lot of, there were 30,000 GIs on this base. And we worked very hard, especially the guys on the hill. But we played hard too. Because right off base, and this is off your question, but right off base there were 200 bars within 3 blocks of being off base. So you worked hard, but you played hard, and we worked. I'll get back to your question in just a second about my impressions of Vietnam, but one of the things that in Japan was there was such a strong camaraderie between people. Of course, there were a lot of guys. We worked shift work, which basically meant that our positions were manned 24 hours a day, and so we would work. And we would go to work we would do 3 afternoons and then be off for, let's say I think it was afternoons and then midnights and then days, and then we were off for 3 days. So we continued. That's the way we worked for 2 years basically, worked shift work, and so it wouldn't no holidays or anything like that. When it was for our time to be on an afternoon shift or a midnight shift, we were there, and so.
When you were in Vietnam, did you have the same feelings of the importance of the mission as you did while you were in Japan, or more so?
Oh, even more so, I think, yeah. Mm-hmm. Because there were obviously I worked in a compound that had a lot of radio equipment in it, and during some of the periods that we were there, we would be monitoring what we were supposed to be monitoring, but we were also monitoring a lot of the companies and the battalion, the people, the guys, the Marines and the Army that were out in the bush, a lot of their communications as well. And so, it wasn't long. These guys were out there, fighting and under fire, and we could hear a lot of their communications.
How did you react to that?
Well, when I was there, it had gotten somewhat weird. One example for you is that during that period, we were there during that period, and there was a lot of, and I don't know if you've heard this term, fragging. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of fragging going on. So a lot of the companies that were on patrol or that had gone out to fight were they had to, before they could fire themselves, they had to have permission from the company commander back, at the post or at the base wherever they were. And I can remember a lot because they tried to put a stop to this and this fragging that was going on, and so they didn't want anybody firing their weapons until they were had given orders to do so. So we had listened to one particular evening. We were listening to a company that had gone out on patrol and kind of had run into the enemy, and they were getting fired on, and they were calling back to the company commander to try to get permission to fire back, and it got real. And the company commander was not there; he was gone, and the squadron or the CO, the guy the runner or whatever, couldn't give the permission. So that's just kind of an example of how intense it would get until the commander comes running and says, permission to fire, and you could tell these guys were out there getting, of course, they've been, some of them I can't imagine they would have waited very much longer, but that's not something I experienced firsthand, but listening to it was quite intense.
For the camera, would you please explain fragging?
Well, fragging is friendly fire, and for example, the shooting of somebody, and a lot of times what the stories that we would hear would be, of course, that the lieutenants that were in charge of these companies in the Army, Marines, whatever, would say, we have orders to go up this road. And the GIs didn't want to go up that road because they knew the enemy was up that road. So they would shoot the lieutenant and say they never heard the order. That's just an example.
With all of this going on in Vietnam and you hearing these incidences firsthand, what was your opinion of the war at that time?
Well, at that time, obviously we were hearing, even though we were quite insulated being in Misawa, Japan, we didn't get a lot of news. There were no cell phones in that day, so we didn't get a lot of information back from the United States other than letters and whatnot. And in our mail, again, when I was in Japan, and we didn't get anything while I was in Vietnam, but was pretty much looked at, and in some respects, we always thought that it was, kind of censored and whatnot. So anyway, but obviously talking to people that had talked to other people, and how the word gets around, but there were a lot of questions about whether we should have been there. I think the overriding factor that most of the guys felt at that point in time was that we were fighting a war that the politicians would not let us win because they were limiting what we could do. I mean, a lot of and one of the things that we did, that we were able to do because of what we did, was we had antennas that were 360-degree antennas. So we could pinpoint, for example, the direction that a radio signal that we were copying, we could pinpoint what direction that came from. So clearly, if you take two other places, and we're copying that same signal that were in different places, we could get an X and we could pinpoint exactly where that location was. And so there were times when we were pinpointing locations in North Vietnam that, based on that, it's called direction finding, that we were told that they would specifically not bomb because intelligence was so good, because other reasons. So I think at that time, when I was there, I was in Vietnam in 1966. I think that the overriding feeling at that time was that we were fighting a war that, whether it was right, wrong, or whatnot, or whether we should be there, whether it was a civil war between two factions of the Vietnamese, that we were fighting a war that we couldn't win, that we were not allowed to win.
What did that do for the morale of the airmen that you worked with? Well,
it didn't affect us nearly as it affected, obviously, the grunts and the Marines and the people that were out on the lines. We were there, and we, the people that I worked with, and the things that I did, that did the things that I did, we were extremely mission oriented. We were convinced anyway that what we were doing had a very high level of value, that we were gathering intelligence that could be used to do a lot of different things, save lives, do things. And so our morale, was very good. And even some of the guys that were airmen, not Marines again, and not Army, that spent a year in Vietnam, I think they felt very good about what they were doing. And I think that really is a big difference in how that all affected me, as opposed to a lot of guys coming back, because we did feel very, very mission. I mean, they were always pounding it into you. So, but we did definitely feel like that what we were doing had a lot of value. And you know, and it was theoretically it was somewhat of a Cold War also in the rest of the world. So,
would you in Vietnam? Would you intercept, say, information of a North Vietnamese troop movement?
That's just some of the things that could be ascertained out of the intelligence that we gathered.
So, your position or your mission helped save American lives, but also helped to fight the enemy. Is that correct?
I think so. Yeah, we always felt so, and you know, and also a major part of what we tried to do was to always determine at what level the Chinese were involved, and what they were doing to aid the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, you know, and those kinds of things. What level Russia was involved, because there were a lot of things. You know, a lot of people didn't think Russia was really involved in that at that time, but based on what I know, I think they were to a certain extent. Maybe not directly, but certainly indirectly.
Back in the States, people were led to believe that the Chinese and the Russians were not involved. And how did that make you feel if you intercepted information knowing that they were involved?
Well, again, we didn't really know at that point in time. You know, we weren't watching. We didn't get the CBS News every night. I mean, we didn't. So we didn't know those things too much about what was known. You know, I mean, I got letters from my friends, and they would make the comment that, you know, you guys shouldn't really be there. But most people, we really didn't know what the sentiment was to a certain extent. But we certainly knew that the Chinese were involved, no matter what they were being told back in the United States.
Going into Vietnam from Japan, you knew that you were going to be there only 89 days?
Correct.
So your 89 days are up.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you go directly back to Japan, or did you have any kind of R&R?
No.
No?
Well, it took... It's always seemed interesting to me was the fact that to get to Vietnam from Misawa, Japan, it took like 5 days. I went from Misawa, Japan to Tokyo, Japan to the Philippines to Thailand and then I think I went through 5 countries to get to Vietnam. So yeah, it was sort of and in pretty much the same way going back. So I would be there for, you know, basically we would do what we didn't fly commercial, so you'd do hops, and being an airman second class at that time, if somebody at a higher rank wanted the seat that I was assigned to, I sat around and waited until the next flight. So I spent a little bit of time in Bangkok, Thailand. At that time, that was pretty much R&R. You know, I was at the Clark Air Base in the Philippines. That wasn't much, but got to see different places.
Being in intelligence, and you're in uniform, and you're having a beer, and another military man asks you what was your job, how would you respond?
You know, during that period of time, we didn't say a whole lot. Again, the classification of the work that we did was highly classified. What I've said today is because it's 42 years ago, but we didn't talk about hardly anything like that. Most of the guys in uniform, they didn't really care what you did, I don't think. We'd talk about, and when we were off duty, the one thing about Japan was that when we were off duty, we didn't have a lot of the rules and regulations that you associate with the military. We had a job to do. If I showed up for my job, they didn't care what I did, you know, when I was off duty. So we didn't have to wear a uniform. We wore civilian clothes. I traveled northern Japan, and we did a lot of traveling around Japan. It was quite interesting. Now and I was in intelligence, which had nothing to do with flying airplanes at the time. And I do recall once in Japan, a guy sat in a bar, a Japanese guy saddled up next to me and asked me, he says, "How much fuel does an F-16 carry?" And I said, "I think somebody told me you could fill it up for $1.50." I think I told him. So I mean, but you get that occasionally, but so we pretty much were. That was one of the really great things about being doing the security service route, was that they pretty much left you alone. I mean, every once in a while we would have inspections and all of that military kinds of things, but not very much of it. As long as you showed up for your job and you did your job. Now, obviously, when I was in Vietnam, it was very controlled. As I said, we basically were on for 12 hours and off for 12 hours, and a lot of times, Da Nang was, guarded by 3,500 Marines, and we'd get these Marine officers that would come by and want us to fill sandbags when we were off duty. So we pretty much tried to hide from those guys when we were not working.
Going back to Vietnam and Da Nang, were you ever attacked?
We had during the time I was there, we had rocket attacks. We were, but it wasn't. There were never any time. I felt one of the things about, I don't know if it's just had to do with the Air Force. I know, but we were trained and we were taught. When I wore my helmet when I was supposed to wear my helmet, wore my flak jacket, so I never really felt like that. We were in jeopardy, but we did get rocket attacks. Never really, that would come into the base and obviously explode, and the sirens would go off, and we'd have to go into the bunkers and do that, and that happened quite often. But it was never, we never had Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese try to overrun the base or anything like that.
So even with the rocket attacks, you still felt pretty secure?
I always felt pretty safe. And it seemed like that, I don't know how they did it, but it seems like that by the time a rocket actually hit the ground, the air raid sirens or the sirens had gone off, and we had 20 or 30 seconds to get into the bunkers. So, I mean, if they'd had 2 or 3 of them landed before the sirens went off and we were caught out and about, I would have felt a little more insecure. They used to always tell us too, and I know this, that there were guys, we actually, on the base, they employed Vietnamese. And a lot of guys used to say, well, this so-and-so, he works in the mess hall, for example, during the day, and then he's out fighting with the Viet Cong against us at night. And one time, a truck was taken over by a guy, and he was running around the base trying to shoot people up, and the air policemen and the Marine policemen were after him, but it was, it wasn't really. I mean, it was clear that there was a war going on, because a lot of times too, during that period of time, companies of Army would come in and they would do R&R on our base. So our base was R&R for Army. I thought, well, it couldn't be too bad. And they'd bring them on base, and they would have quite a time drinking and relaxing.
What were your feelings when you left Vietnam heading back to Japan?
I was not unhappy to go back to Japan and leave Vietnam. It wasn't because of the service there was bad. It was the conditions weren't very good. Obviously, there was nothing to do other than work. The work was satisfying, but like I said before, when I was in Japan, I had a lot of friends and a lot of buddies, and we played hard and worked hard. So I felt like I had accomplished something. I felt good about my service, and was anxious to get back to Japan.
How many more years, or how much longer were you in the service while you were in Japan?
I left Japan in '67, so I was there over a year. Back there over a year. And then I came back to the States and had another year and a half before I was discharged.
Was your responsibilities when you went back to Japan for the final tour pretty much the same as your first time you were in Japan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. I did. I mean, pretty much the same thing. We had what we call positions, and those positions that you worked were 2 receivers and a typewriter and 6-ply paper that was continuous and never ran out. And when I got back, I was put on a very hard position that I worked for almost the entire remainder of all except for about 3 months. It was very hard, and when I say hard, it was very intense. Not because it was important or more important than anything else. It was just, if you can imagine radio signals, which is Morse code's nothing more than a radio signal, and so you have all sorts of pitches and it was interesting. Sometimes these different outstations, and they want to communicate with their control station. That's what we used to call them, control station, outstation. And they would come up, and start signaling Morse code and try to get the attention. And this one position I worked had what I mentioned earlier was a control station, had 10 outstations, which was very unusual, very complex. Normally they would only have maybe 1 or 2, and so the communication would flow very clearly and very cleanly. And Morse code is very similar to someone speaking. It's not always done very well. So these people, either the equipment was bad or they weren't very good at it. And so you had to try to figure out what they're trying to send, and they're not very good at it. And the worst part of it was, in some instances, when they would sometimes I thought they were kids, because 2 or 3 outstations would try to communicate with the control station at the same time, and so they'd get mad at each other because they thought their information was more important than the other one, and there would be times when they would just lay on their key, for example, and be a steady tone, and you couldn't hear anything other than this, and it'd drive you nuts, because obviously, again, we felt very adamant about trying to, make sure we got everything, because, and a lot of times they would get, they always sent their Morse code in code, so it was like, so basically, they would send messages, for example, that were all coded. Well, we were always told we could break their codes and we could get what their messages meant. But occasionally they would get very upset, and they would actually start sending Russian, just speaking back forth in the Russian language. And we always liked those times they would slip up and maybe tell you something that they shouldn't be telling you. So those were all very interesting times that would happen like that. But anyway, when I got back, I got back and I did this position, and as I said, it's 24. A lot of times the Morse code, they would go up, they would come up and they would send messages, and then they would go down, and you'd sit there for 20 minutes or an hour, and they wouldn't send anything. But this particular position that I did, when I would come to work, we had headsets, and there was 2 plug-ins on this, and there were, so I would come in and I would plug in. And there was a guy from the shift that I was relieving, and he would be copying what was going on. I would plug in, I would see where he is, and I'd tap him on the shoulder. He would slide out, and I would slide in. And I would sit there for 8 hours until the guy that relieved me would come in and do exactly the same thing. And I did that for probably 6 or 7 months. It was very, very trying. I broke a few headsets during that period of time.
So you know that your military time is coming to an end, and what were your feelings about coming back home?
Well, I had the luxury of coming back to the United States and serving for another year and a half. So I didn't, I learned very quick. Actually, I was stationed in Omaha, Nebraska, SAC headquarters, Strategic Air Command headquarters. And I obviously learned very quickly what the attitude of everyone was at that point in time. other than military, obviously. So, I made the adjustment. Pretty much, I served my time on the base, and when I was off base, I wore civilian clothes and didn't really talk, didn't act like I was in the service. If I went to a bar or went to a dance or went to a basketball game, we used to go to a lot of hockey games in Omaha. I just acted like I was a civilian.
What did you think of the opinion, though, the anti-war protest against the war?
My opinion at that time, pretty much how I feel today, is that, the war probably wasn't the best thing for this country to do, but I felt like then as I do now, and that is that guys like me, I didn't make that decision. I just chose to serve our country. And I felt like that this country should have appreciated, this is not a new, people have said that, but I really believe that people should have appreciated the service that the men did, and women too, that they did during that period and in that war, especially because they didn't choose to be there. They choose to serve their country, and the country and the leaders of the country made that decision, and that was exactly how I felt at that time. I felt like that, we didn't get any recognition. Not that it really mattered to me that much at the time. When I was discharged, and again, I had already, I knew what the feelings were. So I came back to Muncie and put my uniform away, and basically my friends knew that I'd been in the service, but if I met someone else, I wouldn't bring it up, wouldn't talk about it, and really didn't have a lot of bad experiences. Obviously, I was in college during the Kent State and during the last years of the war, many of the last years of the war, and I always had the attitude that, yeah, it may not have been a just war, it may not have been where we should have been, but I always felt that the servicemen and the women that served there should have been appreciated more, and that they should have been, no matter what. I was never called a baby killer, but I always felt, and I think I mentioned, the one bad experience I had was when I came back to Ball State, and I had back then it was quarter system, but so I had English Lit was one of my mandatory courses, and we had a professor who was obviously anti-war and obviously very adamant in his positions, and he found out that I'd been in the military, and I felt like he basically subjected me to a lot of he would be going through something on this, and all the books that we read were all symbolic, and and he would say, well, Bill Summers, what do you think about that? And, yeah, we messed over the Indians back when we took the country over. Yeah, we did that, so I felt like he picked on me a little bit, and that was fine. I got a C out of his class and moved on down the road. And I was a B+ student at the time. I figured that was my penance.
Is there anything you would like to comment about your military experience that I haven't brought up?
Well, and I'm sure everybody said this, although I think probably the guy, myself, for example, it was a very good growing up experience, and the camaraderie that I met. I mean, I met a lot of, when you're on a base with, thousands of other guys, but I met a lot of good friends, and some of which I still communicate with today. And Japan was a great experience to see the culture as a 20 and 21-year-old of another country. And this is back in the 60s, obviously. And Japan hadn't gotten to their, industrial revolution yet, and they were still really, as I mentioned earlier, we traveled around the country a lot, and we actually were in places that kids or young adults had never seen, they hadn't even seen an American, and it was very. They would come up to you, and all of them had knew at least 2 words of English, and they wanted to lay it on you, and they wanted to try out their 2 or 3 words of English. So it was a very good experience, and I really had at the time I didn't realize it as much, but after getting back and years later, I figured that 2-year period that I spent in Japan probably defined me more than a lot of things did. Just the experiences and the growing up and many things that I can't tell you here on camera, and that we experienced and did, and traveling around and seeing that country in that period. I was there in June of '65, and they had just outlawed prostitution the year before. So in '64, prostitution was legal in Japan. So actually, the '64 Summer Olympics were in Tokyo, and they wanted to clean up their city for that. So they were really just a very, Japan. They had the sanitation systems were what they call benjo ditches. So running down the side of the roads were 2 ditches, and that's where their sanitation, their sewers. That was their sewers, and it was quite a cultural shock for, like I said, somebody that had grown up in Muncie, Indiana, and had now traveled to Japan and see that, and it really kind of woke me up a little bit. Of course, I came back to Muncie, went back to Ball State, and graduated and worked. And I don't, like I said, I don't regret any of it really at all. I'm glad I was able to experience it. As I said, I felt good, even though maybe a lot of people didn't think the war was worth it or we had any right being there. But I felt, like I said earlier, when I came back I felt a definite accomplishment that we had done a good job, and that we were very serious about what we did. So.
On behalf of Ball State University, I want to thank you very much for doing the oral interview with us, and I want to thank you very much for your service to our country.